Well, another 3 months has passed, and that means that we have a brand new set of quarterly 13F filings from some of our favorite US-based super investors. These filings allow us to see everyone's portfolio as long as they're managing more than 100 million US dollars. And it means that we can see the latest moves in the stock market from some of the best investors in the world. People like Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger, Spier, Mohnish, Pabrai, and many more. And in this video, I want to cover some of the latest moves that these super investors have been making. If you enjoy the video, be sure to hit like and also subscribe to the channel so that you can see future 13F update videos when I do them. I try to make these videos every single quarter so that we can keep track of what these super investors are doing, and we can use, their portfolios to hopefully generate some nice investment ideas for ourselves. So that is the topic of today's video, digging into some of the highlights from some of my favorite investors. But before we get into that, we do have a sponsor for today's video, and this video is sponsored by Hatch. Hatch is the platform I personally use for all of my US investing for me as a Kiwi based here in New Zealand. And Hatch is asking you to think about what your big and small tomorrow goals look like. For me, the goal has always been financial freedom, putting a little bit away today with the aim being that I can do the things that I want to do tomorrow. Everyone's tomorrow looks different, whether you want to buy your ultimate dream car, travel the world, or become financially independent. Reaching your goals starts by taking the first step. That's why I invest with Hatch, to help make my plans a reality. And if you want to get started investing with Hatch, check out the first link in the description where you can get a free 20 New Zealand dollar top up when you make your first deposit of 100 New Zealand dollars or more before the 31st of December 2022. Okay, so let's kick this one off with Warren Buffett via Berkshire Hathaway. Warren Buffett, of course, probably being the greatest investor to have ever lived, and still trucking along strong, well into his 90s now, managing Berkshire Hathaway's $300 billion or so portfolio. So let's dive into what's been happening at Berkshire. Of course, Berkshire Hathaway does have a couple of other money managers, being Todd Combs and Ted Weschler. So particularly down the smaller end of the portfolio, we're likely looking at kind of Ted and Todd stocks, but certainly up the top end of the portfolio when we're talking about tens of billions of dollars, even hundreds of billions of dollars in the case of the Apple position now, we're very likely talking about moves directly from Warren Buffett. So upon first impressions, looking at the top 10 holdings for Berkshire, we don't see really any major moves, just kind of a few adjustments around the edges. They added less than 1% to their Apple position, and that still remains by far and away the biggest investment at Berkshire. No change in Bank of America, no change in Coca-Cola, a small add to Chevron, no change in American Express, Occidental, Kraft Heinz, Moody's, US Bancorp had a small trim, and Activision Blizzard had a small addition of about 6%. Now, there is one stock in that top 10 that some of these kind of third-party websites that show the latest moves has been slightly misleading on, and that one is actually Occidental. Now, Occidental looks like it's had no change when I just kind of pay attention to the Whale Wisdom site here, and that's actually not necessarily correct. It has actually changed pretty significantly since the last 13F filing came out. The reason that Occidental says no change is because we've actually been seeing some of the purchases that Buffett has recently been making in Occidental much earlier than the 13Fs have come out. And that's basically because Buffett now is over the 10% ownership threshold at Occidental, which essentially means anytime he buys or sells shares in Oxy, he has to disclose them very quickly through a Form 4 filing. So to give you a more accurate feel for what Buffett has been doing with Occidental, back at his first quarter 13F, he owned 136 million shares. By the time the second quarter 13F was filed, which is the one we're looking at here, he owned 158 million shares. But if we include all the Form 4s, which have come out in the 90-day delay that happens between the end of the second quarter and us getting these 13F filings, he now has a total of 272 million shares in Occidental. So it's really been basically about a 100% increase from his first quarter 13F. So big moves continue in the oil space for Warren Buffett in 2022, and Chevron now comes in at his fourth biggest position in the portfolio, and Occidental comes in at his 6th biggest position, and he now owns more than 20% of the entire company at Occidental. Now, Berkshire Hathaway does have a very top-heavy portfolio. The top 5 or 6 stocks alone represent about 70% of the entire portfolio value for Berkshire, but it is still interesting to see what they're doing throughout the rest of the portfolio. And Berkshire does actually own about 50 stocks or so. It's just the kind of top 5 or so are so large that they're the ones everyone really pays attention to. But if we continue down the list here, we do see a few other moves from Berkshire in the second quarter. Now, they trimmed their Kroger position about 9%. They increased their Paramount Global position 13%. They've trimmed General Motors 14%. And they have also increased 16% the shares that they own in a company called Salanesi Corp. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I have no idea what that company does. If anyone does know that, please let me know down in the comment section below. We saw a 9% add to McKesson Corp, a 234% add to Ally Financial, which is also actually in the portfolio of Norbert, who I will talk about later in this video. We saw an 11% increase in Markel, which interestingly, there's a little bit of kind of Berkshire Hathaway inception going on here because Markel is often referred to as a mini Berkshire Hathaway. They have insurance operations, they have a stock portfolio, and I believe the biggest investment in Markel's stock portfolio is actually Berkshire Hathaway. So interesting to see Berkshire kind of buying itself via Markel, but an 11% increase there. We also had a 53% reduction in shares for Store Capital Corp. And finally, there were 2 stocks that were completely sold out of, which was Verizon, which was pretty well sold all the way down last quarter. It was only a 0.02% position in the portfolio last quarter, but that has now been completely sold out of, as has a company called Royalty Pharma, which again was a very, very small position last quarter. So really no crazy moves from Berkshire and Warren Buffett other than the continued kind of accumulation of shares in some of these oil companies, especially Occidental, in the past few months. Now, for each of these investors, the 13F filing will just give us US stocks, but I'm also going to jump across to a site called TIKR, which will give us some of the international holdings, and there's really nothing to write home about for Berkshire this quarter. And this won't pick up every international stock that Berkshire might own or that any of these investors we'll talk about in the video might own, but if they've bought a big enough, stake in the company to trigger some sort of regulatory filing in the country that, these international stocks are kind of domiciled in, then we should be able to pick those up. So really no additional activity on the international front from Berkshire. Moving now to Charlie Munger via the Daily Journal Corporation. Charlie's 13F has been a really closely followed one in the past several quarters because there's been a bit of a flurry of activity in and around Alibaba. And Charlie Munger seems to be now getting back into classic Charlie Munger mode of really not doing much. So there was zero activity at all in the second quarter from the Daily Journal Corporation. The core holdings remain Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Alibaba, US Bancorp, and POSCO. Now, outside of the US, we do know that the Daily Journal Corporation for a long time has owned BYD. Charlie Munger has disclosed that in some of the Daily Journal annual meetings. Unfortunately, the holding is not big enough to warrant any sort of regulatory filing, so we don't know whether there's been any changes with that BYD position, and there's nothing else on top of that to write home about. No other international filings for DJCO. Moving now to Guy Spier. Guy is building up a bit of a reputation for being the master of doing nothing, and to a pretty large extent he continued that this quarter. Certainly up the top end of the portfolio there were no changes at all, so his top 5 positions remain Berkshire Hathaway, American Express, Bank of America, MasterCard, and Ferrari. But down the smaller end of the portfolio, we did see that he sold 100% of his stock in Twitter. It was previously only a 0.5% position in his US portfolio, and I was lucky enough to have him actually disclose that on the Investing with Tom podcast, so that was kind of cool to hear him say
like
that.
What I own, other than well, I sold Twitter, which was, and I worry about saying that, and I already said it on Twitter, because I don't want to start justifying every portfolio move in a podcast or elsewhere. But
that is the only move that we've seen in the US from Guy Spier. And again, if we jump over to TIKR and look internationally, there are a couple of overseas stocks that do show up for Guy Spier, namely Indian Energy Exchange and a business called TIKR. But as far as I can tell, there haven't been any recent changes in shareholding with those companies. He hasn't bought or sold from what we can see. Moving along to a good friend of Guy Spier's, that being Mohnish Pabrai, and Mohnish Pabrai's US holdings, his 13F, is starting to look pretty unusual. Mohnish Pabrai invests a lot outside of the US, so if we look at the portfolio percentages that we see just purely in the US, they look pretty unusual. So we've only got 2 stocks in there. One is Micron, representing 99.98% of his US portfolio. And we have some residual shares in Seritage Growth Properties, which Mohnish has been getting out of Seritage for a little while. It was only a 0.16% of his US portfolio kind of position last quarter. For some reason, he still owns about $18,000 worth of Seritage, or at least he did as of the end of the second quarter. He may have sold all of that since, but we see a tiny little Seritage position in there, and the big one is obviously the Micron stake. It's about a $100 million position for Mohnish Pabrai at the moment, but he didn't do anything with it in the second quarter. He didn't buy, didn't sell, zero change in shares owned with Micron. Looking internationally now, we do see things get a little more interesting for Mohnish. There's a lot of other stocks that start to show up in the portfolio when we look at some of these overseas holdings. Namely, we have Suntec Realty, no change in shares there, at least as of the 29th of June this year. We see Rain Industries, which looks like it was added to about 31% at the end of June. We also see Nice Holdings, which I believe is a Korean financial company. Shares decreased about 28% in Nice Holdings. And that's really the last stock that we have recent updates on. There are some others that show up in the portfolio, being Racist Logistics, Edelweiss Financial, and Shinnikin, but we don't have any kind of recent regulatory filings around those companies. Now, interestingly, there is one other stock that I have had some regulatory filings sent to me on Twitter about that aren't showing up in TIKR just yet, so not sure exactly what's going on there. But it looks like, there's been some pretty legit filings come out that Mohnish owns a new Turkish stock. And I won't try and pronounce the name of it, but the ticker symbol is TAVHL on the Istanbul Stock Exchange. So I'll put a screenshot of some of the regulatory filings up here so that you can see those. Not sure what sort of weighting that is going to be in the overall Pabrai funds portfolio, but it looks like there is a new Turkish investment from Mohnish. Moving along now to Li Lu from Himalaya Capital Management. Li Lu, of course, manages a reasonably significant amount, at least as I understand it, of Charlie Munger's family money. And he has for a long time been very focused on investing in China. When I first started following Li Lu on these 13F updates, there were actually, I believe, 0 US stocks, but he's got quite a number of them starting to show up in the portfolio now. And there was really one pretty significant move here from Li Lu, and that was quite a significant increase in his holding of Google. Now, we actually see Google show up a couple of times on this 13F. He has increased his holding in the C class shares by 77.18%, and he has also bought an additional class of shares for the first time, ticker symbol GOOGL. So if we look just in the kind of US portfolio, we've got about 17% in one of those share classes and about 5.5% in the other share class. So that gets us to about 22 or 23% in total of his kind of US portfolio, which gets it right up there with Bank of America and makes it pretty close to his second biggest position. I think I'm probably just sitting behind Bank of America and having Google in third place at the moment. And potentially even bigger news than Li Lu adding substantially to his Google position is that he actually sold 100% of his Meta stock. Now, Meta, previously Facebook, has obviously gone through a lot of changes in the last little while, and it's a stock that Li Lu has owned since the second quarter of 2020. He's kind of added to it in the third quarter of 2020. He sold a little bit in the fourth quarter of 2020 and the first quarter of 2021. He then bought more in the fourth quarter of 2021, and now he has exited it altogether. So we've seen some interesting kind of up and down moves over time with Li Lu and Meta, but he is now out completely. Looking internationally, again, I am almost certain that Li Lu will have some international stocks that we're probably not seeing here, but not a whole lot of updates on the international stock holding front. Again, I know that we have previously seen the Chinese EV business BYD show up in the Himalaya capital filings here internationally. That did drop off a few months ago, and there are some people that I follow on Twitter again digging into that, and it doesn't look like there's actually been any sales from Li Lu related to BYD as far as we can tell, but for whatever reason that does seem to have dropped off some of the websites. So no other major updates on the international front from Li Lu, but very interesting to see him swing pretty big at Google. Now, two final investors I want to take a look at are Norbert Lu and Cliff Sosin. Now, Norbert Lu runs a fund called Punch Card Management, and I believe that fund was initially kind of given its first big chunk of capital from Joel Greenblatt after Joel Greenblatt discovered Norbert Lu via the Value Investors Club. So I always like to follow along with what Norbert Lu is doing. He runs a very concentrated portfolio like a lot of these investors do. And in the US for a long time, we have only ever seen 3 stocks sitting in there, and those stocks have been Berkshire Hathaway, Ally Financial, and Winnebago, the RV and kind of lake boat now business. And we saw a few changes in that US portfolio, including one brand new stock altogether. So if we run through the US portfolio for Norbert Lu, we have Berkshire Hathaway, which had no change. Ally Financial was added to about 6%. Winnebago was added to a very small degree, less than 1%. And we have a brand new position, admittedly quite a small one, only a 2% stake in the portfolio at the moment, but a brand new position in Smith & Wesson. Looking internationally, we do actually see 3 additional stocks for Norbert Lu, those being Naked Wines, Countryside Partnerships, and Motorpoint Group PLC, I believe all UK-based businesses. Now, Naked Wines and Motorpoint Group have been in the portfolio for some time, but we did see Norbert Lu add about 11% to his Naked Wines position and about 5% to Motorpoint Group. And we saw a brand new position pretty recently here in Countryside Partnerships PLC. Now, the reason Countryside Partnerships really catches my attention is basically because it is a home builder based in the UK, which is buying back a lot of shares. And if you know anything about Norbert Lu, one of his most famous investments ever has been in a business called NVR. He wrote it up on Value Investors Club in the very early 2000s. I believe won one of the weekly $5,000 prizes from Joel Greenblatt for that write-up. And the stock has been just ridiculously successful since the early 2000s. And I think since the mid-90s, it's up about 600x. And it was a home builder that has bought back about 75% or so of their shares over time. So pretty interesting to see a potentially comparable UK business trying to take an NVR type philosophy, and even more interesting to see Norbert Lu purchase into it. Now, the last investor on the list here that I want to cover is a guy by the name of Cliff Sosin. When I have covered Cliff Sosin in previous updates, I've said something to the effect of Cliff Sosin has the best track record that I have ever seen of a hedge fund manager in the past decade. But unfortunately, Cliff Sosin has had a pretty rough time in terms of what his stocks have done in 2022. And a lot of his performance was driven predominantly by getting in pretty early into Carvana, which he first purchased in the first quarter of 2018, and that had been a super successful investment for him. And Carvana has kind of not done particularly well at all in 2022. So I think it's really fascinating to kind of track along with what Cliff Sosin is doing. He now knows Carvana very well. He's had a lot of success with the business, and I think he is a pretty rational long-term thinker, and I really like watching his interviews and that sort of thing as well. So a bit of activity here from Cliff Sosin in the second quarter 13F. His largest position, I would say largely due to the price declines in Carvana, is now Hilton Grand Vacations, even though he made no change to the shares there. With Carvana, he did add 61% to the position, no change in Cardlytics, no change in World Acceptance Corp, an 8% increase in Party City, and a 100% sale, completely exited Herbalife. So very interesting to see Cliff Sosin continue to add to Carvana given all the price declines and some of the things that are happening with the business. He still clearly has a lot of conviction over the long term about what that company's prospects look like, and that will be a very interesting one to continue to follow along with as well. Now, looking internationally, we do see one additional stock for Cliff Sosin, which is a business called Basic Fit NV. At least of the stocks that we can see in the publicly available data, looks like about a 6% position for Cliff Sosin, although we haven't had an updated shareholder report since the end of December 2021. So that would lead me to believe that he is just continuing to hold the stock, and that is the single, international stock that we can see in the portfolio at the moment for Cliff Sosin. So there you have it. Those are some of my highlights from this year's 13F season. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to hit like and also subscribe to the channel if you are new here. That's all I've got from this one, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers.